The life of someone who cannot say no. It usually looks harmless from the outside. A simple request, a favor, a message asking, "Can you help me with something?" But inside, it feels like a tightening in the chest, a flicker of fear that's so subtle it almost passes as nothing. I once watched someone I cared about go through this, a friend who always said yes, even when her voice trembled. I remember standing with her outside a cafe as her phone buzzed again. It was another request, one she didn't have the time or energy for. She looked down at the screen and I watched the conflict travel across her face. She whispered something almost no one ever hears from people like her. She said, "I don't want to, but I will." And that line stayed with me because it revealed something that wasn't just about her. It was something many people quietly live with. This script isn't about the idea of being nice or helpful. It's about the deeper psychology of why some people feel unable to say no even when their entire body is quietly begging them to. It's about the tension between wanting to protect your peace and fearing what might happen if you disappoint someone. People often think this inability is harmless or just a personality trait. But when you look closely, you see it's shaped by years of conditioning, emotional patterns, unspoken expectations, and the internal weight of needing to be accepted. For many people, the fear of saying no doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like survival. It feels like the only way to keep the world steady and predictable. And what's strange is that this pattern often begins long before adult life. It begins in childhood, in the tiny moments when approval felt like safety and disapproval felt like emotional coldness. When someone grew up believing that being agreeable was the way to avoid conflict, discomfort, or being misunderstood. When they learned that their value came from being useful, accommodating, or easy. And even now in adulthood, that conditioning doesn't disappear. It simply becomes more subtle. It shows up in the way a person answers messages immediately, even when they are exhausted. It shows up in the way someone apologizes for things that aren't their responsibility. It shows up in how they shrink their own needs because they fear being seen as difficult, demanding, or ungrateful. The psychology of someone who can't say no is woven into years of quiet moments like this, moments that have taught them that their comfort is less important than someone else's expectations. If you've ever felt that pressure, you know the sensation. Well, it's not a loud fear. It's not dramatic. It feels more like a silent obligation. You feel responsible for the emotional climate around you. You feel like a buffer between people. You feel like saying yes is a way of keeping the peace, even if the cost is your own well-being. And the strange thing is that the people who struggle with this often seem calm on the surface. They appear responsible, reliable, dependable. But internally, they're carrying a weight no one else sees. A weight built from years of feeling that they must earn their place through agreement. There is a deeply human reason behind all of this. People who struggle to say no are often deeply empathetic. They feel other people's emotions intensely. They are sensitive to disappointment, to subtle shifts in tone, to the heaviness in someone's voice. Their mind anticipates reactions before they even happen. They imagine all the possible ways someone might take their refusal. And even if the reality is that nothing bad would happen, the psychological imprint from earlier experiences whispers otherwise. This isn't weakness, it's emotional wiring. It's the result of having a mind that scans for connection and harmony. But when that ability to sense others becomes stronger than the ability to sense oneself, the person begins to abandon themselves slowly, not dramatically. Slowly, quietly, one yes at a time. You see it in friendships where they show up every time, even when they're tired. You see it in relationships where they carry more emotional labor than they're able to. You see it at work where they take on more responsibility, not because they want to, but because they fear being seen as not dedicated enough. These small moments accumulate until a person begins to live a life shaped more by obligation than by intention. The truth is, people who can't say no often grew up believing that their presence had to be earned, that affection was conditional, that being cooperative was the safest way to be seen, to be valued, or to avoid emotional distance. And even in adulthood, the mind carries those memories into new situations. Even when the circumstances are different, the brain isn't trying to hold someone back. It's trying to protect them from a fear that once felt real. There's a certain heaviness in admitting this to yourself, a heaviness in realizing that your inability to say no isn't just a bad habit. It's a psychological instinct formed when you were too young to understand what was happening. It becomes part of the lens through which you view relationships, part of the quiet rules you follow without even thinking. People who can't say no often feel responsible for others' emotions. They feel responsible for the comfort of the room. They feel responsible for making things easier for everyone else. And this responsibility becomes so internalized that they don't even question it anymore. They assume it's who they are. They assume this is the role they must play. But underneath that habit is a deeper truth. They are afraid of what their no might reveal. They fear it might expose conflict or disappointment or distance or the possibility that someone might care a little less. This fear doesn't come from weakness, but from a history of trying to keep things steady, trying to avoid the feeling of being the cause of tension, trying to maintain emotional balance, even at their own expense. And the world rarely sees this struggle. Most people don't notice when someone agrees reluctantly. Most don't hear the quiet hesitation before the yes. Most don't see the internal conversation a person has with themselves in the milliseconds before responding. But those who live with this pattern know the moment well. The pause, the breath, the feeling in the chest, the subtle sensation of surrender even when they don't want to. There's also a subtle fear of identity loss here. People who can't say no often build their identity around being reliable. They fear that saying no might make others see them differently. They fear that refusing something makes them less valuable, less needed, less appreciated. When your sense of worth is tied to being agreeable, saying no feels like rejecting the version of yourself you believe others depend on. In psychology, there is a concept sometimes discussed around how people internalize expectations from their environment. When someone grows up seeking approval, their brain becomes attuned to external cues. They learn to mirror what others want. They learn to adapt before anyone even asks them to. Over time, this becomes automatic. They say yes instinctively, even before considering what they actually want. This creates a strange kind of loneliness, a loneliness where a person feels surrounded by people yet disconnected from themselves. Because when you spend years prioritizing others, it becomes difficult to even know what your true preferences are anymore. You lose touch with what you genuinely want. And even when you pause long enough to ask yourself, the answer feels distant, unclear, almost unfamiliar. People who can't say no often feel like they're living two lives. The external one where they appear kind, helpful, dependable, and the inner one where they feel quietly drained. They rarely express how much they're carrying. They rarely reveal how exhausted they truly are. They don't want to inconvenience anyone with their struggles. They don't want to become a burden, so they carry their tiredness in silence, convincing themselves that this is just part of who they are. I've met so many people who say yes while their heart whispers no. They think agreeing keeps things stable, but deep down they know it slowly chips away at their inner strength. They tell themselves they'll stop someday after this one request, after this one favor, after this one situation. But then another request arrives and the pattern continues, not because they wanted to, but because the discomfort of saying no feels heavier than the cost of saying yes. There's also an element of empathy-driven fear here. People who can't say no imagine the emotional impact of their refusal so vividly that it becomes overwhelming. They picture the disappointment, the confusion, the possible misunderstanding. Even if none of this would actually happen, the imagined scenario feels too real to dismiss. So they say yes to avoid the emotional turbulence their mind predicts. But the truth is, this isn't just about keeping others happy. It's about avoiding the internal storm that saying no triggers. It's about avoiding guilt, even if the guilt isn't justified. It's about avoiding the sensation of letting someone down, even when the request was unreasonable. The brain isn't trying to be dramatic. It's trying to protect the person from emotional discomfort. This script isn't about blame. It's about understanding a deeply human pattern that many people quietly live with. Because beneath every yes that didn't feel right, there's a story. A story of someone who learned to sacrifice themselves for stability. Someone who learned to be agreeable before they learned to be authentic. Someone who learned that being easy to love meant to being easy to handle. And if you've ever lived this way, you know that the hardest part isn't the request itself. It's the moment after the yes, when you walk away feeling a little smaller, when you feel like you've betrayed yourself in some quiet way, when you realize that your willingness to accommodate others is slowly turning into a habit of abandoning your own boundaries. But here's the thing. People who can't say no aren't weak. They're deeply attuned. They're often some of the most emotionally intelligent people in the room. They're thoughtful, they're aware, they're perceptive, they sense tension before others do. They notice the expressions people don't comment on. They're the ones who bring calm, who bring understanding, who bring harmony. The problem isn't their empathy. The problem is the imbalance between empathy for others and empathy for themselves. If you've ever struggled to say no, it's not because you don't have preferences. It's because you've spent years deprioritizing them. It's not because you're incapable of boundaries. It's because your relationship with boundaries has been shaped by experiences where expressing your needs felt risky or burdensome. And when you carry this internal conflict long enough, it becomes part of your emotional identity. But deep down, you know something isn't sustainable. You feel the quiet fatigue that grows with every unspoken desire. You feel the subtle ache of putting yourself second again and again. You feel the slow accumulation of emotional exhaustion that builds from giving more than you have. There comes a moment in a person's life when they begin to feel the quiet consequences of always saying yes. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It isn't dramatic. It comes like a slow erosion, like a shoreline being pulled back grain by grain. One day they realize they're tired in a way that rest can't fix. Not physically tired, but emotionally worn down. A kind of tiredness that comes from being stretched too thin, from giving too much of themselves in too many small ways. And the strange thing is, it doesn't usually come from one major event. It comes from hundreds of moments where they ignored their own limits, hundreds of situations where they softened their own needs for someone else's comfort. This kind of exhaustion is subtle but powerful. It changes the way a person feels in their own skin. It makes them question why they feel disconnected from themselves. It makes them wonder why small tasks feel heavier than they should. It makes them feel separate from the world even when surrounded by people. And it all traces back to the simple habit of never being able to say no. People assume that saying yes keeps relationships peaceful. But what they don't realize is that someone who can't say no often ends up forming relationships built on imbalance. They attract people who expect them to be available all the time because that's the pattern they've presented. They become the dependable one, the one who always shows up, the one who never asks for much in return. And over time, this role becomes both comforting and suffocating. Comforting because it feels familiar, suffocating because it leaves little room for growth or authenticity. You don't realize how much you're shrinking until someone finally asks what you want, and you don't know how to answer. Not because you don't have desires, but because you've pushed them so far down that they've become quiet, distant, hard to reach. People who struggle to say no often forget their own preferences. They forget what they enjoy. They forget what they need. They forget what feels right to them. They've practiced putting others first for so long that turning inward feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable. And when they finally do try to say no, the guilt rushes in like a flood. It's an irrational guilt, but it feels real. It feels like failure. It feels like letting someone down, even when the no is reasonable, even when the request was unfair, even when the person has done too much already. The guilt still arrives because the guilt isn't about the situation. It's about the identity they've built around being agreeable. The mind carries old emotional memories like echoing shadows. If someone grew up feeling responsible for the emotions of others, that responsibility doesn't disappear just because they've grown older. It lingers in the body. It lives in the reflex. It shows up every time they imagine someone being upset with them. The fear isn't about the present moment. It's about reliving a dynamic that once felt unavoidable. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the person everyone depends on. People admire you for being reliable, but they rarely ask how you're doing. People thank you for being helpful, but they rarely consider the cost. People lean on you, but they rarely wonder how much weight you're already carrying. And you, in turn, don't speak up, because speaking up feels like breaking the unspoken contract. The contract that says, I'll be easy, I'll be agreeable, I'll carry things quietly. But the truth is, no matter how strong a person is, everyone has limits. And ignoring those limits catches up eventually. It shows up as irritability, as burnout, as emotional disengagement. It shows up as resentment, even if the person doesn't want to feel that way. It shows up as a quiet sense of being unseen. People who can't say no start to feel invisible in their own lives, not because others don't care, but because they never give others the chance to truly see them. There's also a pattern where they convince themselves they don't mind doing things. They tell themselves the favor isn't a big deal. They tell themselves they're helping because they're kind. But deep down, they feel the emotional drain. They feel the quiet resentment building. Not anger toward others, but frustration with themselves for not being able to choose differently. You can only ignore your inner voice for so long before it starts pushing back. That voice gets quieter over the years, but it never disappears. It waits. It waits for moments of stillness. It whispers during moments when everything finally quiets down. It asks questions that are hard to face. Questions like, when will you choose yourself? And how long will you keep shrinking to fit into spaces that don't consider you? And here's something important. The process of learning to say no isn't about becoming harsh or distant. It isn't about building walls or rejecting people. It's about learning to exist without fear. It's about recognizing that your needs matter as much as anyone else's. It's about realizing that protecting your energy isn't selfish. It's responsible. It's healthy. It's necessary for your emotional survival. Saying no is not an act of conflict. It's an act of clarity. Most people don't realize that someone who can't say no often imagines consequences that are far heavier than anything that would actually happen. They imagine losing relationships. They imagine disappointing people so deeply that it changes how they are seen. They imagine conflict where none would likely occur. But these fears are based not in reality, but in past emotional experiences. If you peel back the layers, you'll find that people who can't say no often grew up in environments where their emotional safety depended on being cooperative. Maybe one parent had unpredictable reactions. Maybe love felt conditional. Maybe approval was given only when they were obedient or helpful. And the child who grows up in such a world learns to adapt quickly, learns to read emotional cues instinctively, learns to soften themselves to avoid conflict. As adults, these same patterns remain even when the circumstances are different. The brain remembers what once kept you safe, even if it's now holding you back. And yet beneath all the layers of fear, there is another truth. Most people want authenticity from the people they care about. Most people don't want someone who's always agreeable. They want someone who is honest, who is grounded, who knows their limits. A person who never says no becomes unpredictable in their emotional availability. People don't always trust a yes that seems automatic. They sense the hesitation beneath it, even if it's subtle. Saying no actually creates healthier relationships. It brings balance. It sets clear expectations. It allows others to know where you stand, and it teaches them how to treat you. When a person finally begins to say no, even in small ways, they start to feel something they haven't felt in a long time. A sense of their own presence, the feeling of returning to themselves after being absent within their own decisions for years. There's a moment that happens when someone says no for the first time after a lifetime of saying yes. Their voice sounds unfamiliar, their chest tightens, their mind races. But after the moment passes, something softens inside. A kind of quiet relief, a realization that the world didn't fall apart, the relationship didn't collapse. The fear was louder than reality. And with each no that follows, they begin to reclaim a part of themselves. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It happens the same way the erosion occurred. Gradually, they begin to feel a subtle shift in their sense of identity. They start noticing what they actually want. They begin separating their genuine desires from their conditioned obligations. They start picking up the fragments of themselves that were left behind in all the previous yeses. This reclaiming of the self is not selfishness. It is healing. It is growth. It is the process of becoming an emotionally whole person. People who can't say no often have a strong sense of empathy for others. What they lack is empathy for themselves. And learning to say no is a way of restoring that balance. There's a quiet kind of strength in it, not the loud, aggressive kind, but the steady, gentle kind. The strength that comes from knowing your limits, from respecting your own time, from acknowledging that your emotional energy is not infinite. And something changes when a person starts honoring their boundaries. Their relationships become more genuine. They become more present. They stop feeling resentful because they stop abandoning themselves. It also shifts how others perceive them. People begin to understand that their time has value. Their presence has value. Their effort is not something to be taken for granted. And because of that, the person who once felt invisible becomes more respected, not less. Saying no doesn't push people away. It filters who truly values you. There's something transformative about realizing that relationships built on your silence are not relationships that sustain you. They drain you. But relationships built on mutual respect, where your needs are seen and honored, those relationships allow you to thrive. Sometimes the hardest part is not saying no to others, but saying no to the version of yourself that believes you must be endlessly available. Saying no to the voice that tells you you're only worthy when you are giving. Saying no to the internal pressure to be agreeable at all costs. This is the number that changes everything, the number that liberates, and with time something unexpected happens. The guilt fades, not instantly, but slowly. The emotional reflex weakens. The mind begins to understand that refusing someone is not the same as hurting them, that setting limits is not the same as creating conflict, that protecting your energy is not the same as being selfish. The person begins to feel a sense of power they've never known before, the power of living in alignment with their truth. You start to feel the difference between a yes that drains you and a yes that comes from a genuine place. You begin to see how much emotional space opens up when you stop overextending yourself. You notice that small things feel lighter. You feel more present in conversations. You feel more grounded in your decisions. Over time, saying no becomes less about avoiding exhaustion and more about honoring who you are. It becomes a way of shaping your life with intention, a way of making sure that your time, your energy, and your presence go to the things and people that truly matter. And here's the quiet truth behind it all. The moment you start saying no, the world doesn't collapse. It expands. You gain time, you gain clarity, you gain yourself. The version of you who always said yes was trying their best, trying to survive, trying to be loved. But the version of you who learns to say no begins to live. Not just survive, you start attracting people who appreciate your boundaries instead of those who benefit from your lack of them. You start feeling more authentic in your interactions. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop shrinking to fit into emotional spaces that weren't built for you. And for the first time in a long time, you begin to feel what it's like to simply be, to exist without obligation, to breathe without pressure, to show up because you want to, not because you feel you have to. It is a quiet freedom, but one that changes everything. Eventually, you reach a place where saying no feels natural, where it feels like an act of alignment rather than defiance, where it feels like choosing yourself, not rejecting others. And in that place, you rediscover something you may not have felt since childhood. Your own presence, your own preferences, your own voice, the part of you that existed before the world, taught you to soften every edge. And that is the deepest transformation of all, the return to your inner self after years of losing pieces of it in every yes that didn't belong to you.